My name is Alexandra Hodkowski. I'm the curator of public programs here at the museum, and I also have the pleasure of leading the National Design Awards, a Cooper Hewitt initiative launched in 2000. Through the annual awards and their associated public programs, like what we're having here tonight, we seek to increase national awareness of the impact of design in our everyday lives. Each year, an esteemed jury selects winners across 10 design disciplines, recognizing individuals and firms whose work is shaping our world. Tonight, we are delighted to hear from Michael Maltzan, the 2025 National Design Award winner for architecture, and the founder of Los Angeles-based firm MMA, which began in 1995. He will be in conversation with Florian Idenburg, co-founding partner of New York-based architecture firm Soil, which he founded with his partner Jing Liu in 2008. Together, they will explore questions of urban housing across coasts, drawing from their distinct practices and shared concerns. Just to set the expectations, this is not an LA versus New York showdown, so if you came for that, I'm sorry. But instead, it's really a shared conversation about how architects are grappling with the complexities of urban housing wherever they work, and what we can learn from them as leaders who help us imagine new ways of living, regardless of geography, with imagination, experimentation, and persistence. I'm now going to pass things over to Jack Murphy, who has prepared a wonderful introduction and will offer a brief overview of Michael and Florian's work in housing. For those of you who may not know Jack, he is the editor-in-chief of the Architect's newspaper and AN Interior, and a vital connective force in the field across the United States. And he has a keen finger on the pulse of housing issues today, which is why we invited him here to do the intro. I'm going to leave it and just say that I began my role here just over 2 years ago with a goal of elevating architecture programming at the museum, and I couldn't be more honored to welcome Michael, Florian, and Jack to open up to us tonight this evening about their work and ambitions, and to have all of you here too, and hear your voices. There'll be some time for questions at the end. So thank you, and welcome, Jack.
Okay, hello, can you hear me? Yes, yes, 1, 2, okay. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here to contextualize and give a quick introduction to the conversation that's going to happen. As Alexandra mentioned, I edit the Architect's newspaper. For the publication and for my work as an editor and journalist, housing is a key concern of what we cover, and it's also a key concern for architects practicing today. When done well, it's a project type that can improve 2 related shortages in the country. One is affordability, which, as we saw in New York, was a key driver of the recent mayoral campaign. The second is the loneliness epidemic, in which people feel isolated or disconnected from each other. And so architects working on housing can really address both of these concerns together through taking on housing commissions and being really thoughtful with the way that buildings offer the possibility for connection between residents and between residents and their neighbors. It's not a surprise to say that housing has been a concern for architects for a very long time. It was a key mission of modernism at the start of the 20th century. This is not a new problem or topic about the delivery of housing, and in particular affordable housing. What if I told you that I have a strategy for a collective attack on housing that has 7 points of action? Are you ready for these? You can count to 7 with me. Comprehensive planning, large-scale operations, mass production, efficient design, limited profits, cheap money, and state subvention. How does that sound? Does it sound good? Are we ready for this? Can we get the signs out? So actually, this is precisely what Lewis Mumford proposed in his essay accompanying MoMA's Modern Architecture exhibition. This is 1932. That was over 90 years ago. So clearly, it's still something we're grappling with and has only gotten worse. It has only worsened over time. With housing, often the most difficult part of its production can be the funding, regulatory environment, and the constraints that shape this space of possibility that architects deal with. And so those constraints and the difficulties of this type of work is precisely why it's commendable to look at the work of Michael and Florian and to even interrogate why it's successful and what it means. So they take on these limitations and deliver work that is still formally inventive through its organization, materials, and construction methods. So again, it's not LA versus New York, but these are architects who, these two architects are in conversation. They share similarities, as we'll see in a sec with some of their work. They both elect to have the Dutch photographer Iwan Baan document their work. They both teach. Michael is about to begin a master class or a workshop, excuse me, at the Cooper Union, and Florian teaches at Cornell from their New York campus. So I hope to learn from the conversation. I hope it will be real and honest. And now I have the unenviable task of going through some of their work in front of them with you so that you have at least a visual reference for some of the projects that are really important to each practice when related to housing. So how many of you have ever visited in person a building by Michael Maltzan or Solid Objectives? Okay. Okay. That's good. I'll call that 25 to 30 to 35%. So good. Okay, so there's some at least embodied familiarity. Okay, very quickly. The work of Michael Maltzan Architecture, as Alexander mentioned, founded in 1995. Michael's originally from the East Coast, and I think you even spent time as a kid in Levittown, where you grew up. Works on a range of projects, cultural projects, institutional buildings for colleges, and housing on both single-family commissions and apartment buildings. So we're going to go through 3 projects very quickly so that you have a context for what they'll be discussing. So this is the Star Apartments building. It's the building kind of lower right on the image here, completed in 2014, $20.5 million, completed for the Skid Row Housing Trust. There was an existing one-story, and please tell me if I'm getting this wrong. So, okay, thank you. All right. This is like nightmare stuff. Okay. So there was an existing one-story building in downtown LA. It was transformed into a mixed-use complex, 122 apartments for formerly homeless individuals. You can see here that this podium level has space on the ground floor for community activity, and then there are apartments above it. The top of the podium is accessible and used for outdoor activity. This is notable. The project is notable because the apartments which sit on the superstructure were prefabricated. They were craned in, and this helped to meet the budget, deliver a higher quality of construction, meet construction tolerances, accelerate timeline, and deal with sustainability. So here are some of this is an interior shot of the building from the outside here. So you can see the kind of quality of this project built up over an existing piece of the city. Second project, this is 26.2 apartments. This is completed more recently. This is 2023 for the Accelerate Housing Group. This is in Long Beach, so it's close to the port of Los Angeles. It's 5 stories, permanent supportive housing. Here, this is 77 units. It faces the Pacific Coast Highway. on this kind of main arterial street, and then steps down to a neighborhood scale on the side street. So you can see the buildings massing, going from taller to smaller, and with these gabled forms on the top and bottom of the building. Shots from the inside here where color becomes important for identifying pieces of the building. And then this is kind of an inspirational image, Stephen Shore photograph of what this area still feels like. The last one is 1 Santa Fe. This is in just east of downtown LA. You can see the 6th Street Viaduct here, which is also a project by the office. This is a really long market rate housing project, or 80-20, 80% market rate housing project. It's right next to SciArc, which is another very linear building right across the street. This combines residential, retail, commercial, and open space into a 510,000 square foot project. It spans a very narrow site of previously vacant land adjacent to a rail yard, 438 units in this 80-20 split of market rate affordable. So you can see some of the moments where it meets the First Street bridge. A drawing. And then it has a kind of open space where the two wings of the building span over a parking lot where there are shops here. I should also note that Hennessy and Ingalls, the art and architecture bookstores in the ground floor here. It's a very good spot in Los Angeles. So those are 3 projects from Michael. For his conversational partner, Florian, working at Soil with his partner, Jing. You grew up in the Netherlands, you worked at Sana, and the office works on, again, cultural, civic, residential, a wide range of project types. I'll go through 3 that are, I think, really useful to set the stage for the housing work you're doing here in New York. The first, Las Americas, is a prototype for vertical building in Leon, Mexico, which is in Guanajuato, north of Mexico City. 60 units in this kind of figure 8 shape with 2 courtyards, expressed with a slab and then kind of infill block construction. And then so here part of the idea is, rather than a sprawling metropolis or informal city, this kind of builds density adjacent to recreation or closer to the center of the city. How many of you have seen this building? Good, okay, that's a good amount here. Good, this is closer to home. This is 144 Vanderbilt in Brooklyn. It's the 3rd in a series of buildings that Soil is doing for the developer Tank House. This is a series of projects that are really transforming conventional multifamily housing in New York. You might know the previous one, which is 450 Warren and 9 Chapels in downtown Brooklyn. So this one, similar to 26.2, masses up along the main street of Myrtle Avenue and then steps down along Vanderbilt. So the difference in kind of zoning allowance or even massing shapes the building. As you can see here, it has this like staggered look, and it has a very distinctive pink precast facade. Is that right? Okay, you can just yell out if it's not. There are also some really nice outdoor spaces in the back of the building in different levels. And this is a shot of the interior. Okay, last project. 450 Union. 20 stories under construction at Union and the Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn. So this is 158 units, also for tank house, and as I mentioned, under construction. So this takes, I would say, a similar massing language of these kind of room-sized strips, and rather than doing it in precast, it's clad in brick. The main entrance for the building faces the canal, or there is it's on the side. Okay, so but there is like a relationship to the canal that's being built. This rendering and then images looking across the canal. So this is like the frontage along the canal. It's rental. 27%. Okay. So that's 27%. Okay. I'm not going to subtract that from 100 in front of a live audience. But you can see here the work that's underway here. Just to give you a visual tour through the work of each of our two guests. And so with that, just in your head, thinking through the work that they've delivered, the work that's underway, I want to welcome Michael and Florian to the stage. And then I hope you can start the conversation by sharing about the first commission or your first urban housing project and kind of go from there. So welcome, thank you.
Fantastic. You want me to start with that?
I think so. West Coast first.
Matches on. Thank you, Jack, Alexandra. The first project that we did, first housing project, was a project that was called Rainbow Apartments. And the names, it was our first project with a client, Skid Row Housing Trust, which is a nonprofit housing developer who was just starting to move from building buildings that were about transitional housing to a new model, permanent supportive housing, which is exactly what it says it is. It's housing where individuals can live there ostensibly for the rest of their lives. They have a permanent place. And supportive services are brought into the building, and it was important to sustain the community, but it created a complexity that they just was a new invention for them. And I'd always wanted to do housing. In fact, I always thought I would do housing. When we were in school, and Jack, you mentioned this, that housing was such a part of the history of at least modernism, the way I thought about architecture, was taught about architecture. I thought it was inevitable that you would do housing when you became an architect. But in LA, nobody was really doing housing, multifamily housing. Nobody was hiring architects that looked like us or doing work that looked like our work. And so I had kind of given it up, the idea that we would get to do it. The trust called because of another project, a school that we had done, and asked if we'd be interested, and I was ecstatic. So we did this project. It was 90 units, permanent supportive housing, and it was built just before, it started construction just before the crash in 2008. And so we started building the project, and the contractor had a cost plus contract with the client, which meant they would just buy whatever they needed and add a percentage on top of it. And things just started to go crazy during this inflationary run-up, and we were having to pull things out of the project left and right. It was like driving a car down the road and tossing the windshield off and pulling off the door handles and getting rid of some seats. When we finished the project, I was really upset about it because it felt like we'd pulled all of the qualities out of the building for the residents. But the building was a success, and a lot of it had to do, I came to realize, with these kind of fundamental ideas that we had learned in architecture in school. And I went back to the clients, and most architects would do one of these projects, maybe the transitional housing, and then say, okay, we're done. This is really too hard, and not do it again. And I thought the only way you can really do that work is by continuing to do it, to do multiple projects, to keep taking those lessons and move on. So I said I asked him, we have to do more projects together, and that really started this longer conversation. And in that that regard, the client was hugely instrumental in the overall equation.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the idea of what do we learn in school, and then how do you end up being able to apply that in practice. I'm really excited Cooper Hewitt is taking on architecture here, and I'm glad we're on this panel, and I hope there will be more of this. And I think indeed the conversation around sort of what the role of architecture can be needs to be held everywhere, but I think specifically in housing it's very important to bring it in. Because I studied in Delft in the Netherlands. It's a public university. Basically 80% of our education was drawing housing plans with the full assumption that we would be doing housing, which in the Netherlands largely as sort of public-private entities that produce about, I think 2/3 of the housing in the Netherlands is held within these large sort of organizations. So there's a lot of, housing is like a fundamental part of the role of the architect. Fast forward through Japan, Jing and I ended up here in New York, and we thought, we need to do housing, and how do you get into housing? Our first, we did a number of competitions. We did student housing in Greece in 2008. It was not really great timing to do a project in Greece. We then joined a competition here. Mayor Bloomberg, maybe people remember, was exploring the micro unit as a way to keep affordable units in Manhattan. It's very hard for many people to be able to afford living in Manhattan. So there was, through this idea of relaxing the minimum square footage of what a unit can be, which is 450 square foot, but sort of reducing that, seeing if there could be more affordable units kept in the city. And architects won that one at Carmel Place. And that project actually led to our first housing project, which, for which we had to go to Mexico. Somebody who worked for Infonavit. Infonavit is the sort of Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae of Mexico, who helps basically the sort of lower demographics economically. So that actually the 50% of housing in Mexico is self-built, and so Infonavit is trying to formalize that housing stock, and so we were asked to go to Leon and build that project, in which we tried to introduce a lot of the sort of values that were in these earlier projects, and now we're trying to bring into the sort of market rate projects we're doing with Tank House. So it was quite a journey, I guess, and certainly I think, it's interesting to think through. I guess we have another cheat sheet here, but why did you consider? But maybe, well, I think it's pretty natural that we both wanted to be right in housing. But I think it's interesting that a lot of your work is with non-profits. It's the same non-profit that you have been working with on all those projects?
Almost. The large majority of the work has been with Skid Row Housing Trust, which has had more recently real challenges because that world, the nonprofit development world, housing world, is always walking on this kind of knife edge. It's very difficult to put the capital stack together, to put the money together. It feels like they're going after everything, and one step short of doing bake sales on the sidewalk. And it means that that the financing is precarious and they take a very long time. Especially in Los Angeles, there's so many hurdles and entitlements and challenges in terms of the political structure of development in the city that at times these projects can take 12, 13 years from inception to finally beginning to develop the projects. And that's a huge burden. A market rate developer wouldn't.
That's a little bit Ezra Klein's abundance argument, no?
Exactly.
And is Gavin Newsom now not completely changing that? Meaning, aren't you mandated?
The thing, it's interesting because the state and the city politics, while they may share a kind of larger political approach or attitude, they're very different. And housing, especially affordable housing, nonprofit housing, comes up against the structures of the city constantly. For instance, in Los Angeles, I'm very interested in how New York will continue to evolve with your new mayor, because in LA, we have a very different system. It's a weak mayor system. They have the same true political constitutional power as any other of the council people throughout the city. They have the bully pulpit. They can be out there in public more, but they're not really able to push on these projects. And so what happens is Newsom, the mayor, any of the kind of state legislatures, they can try to require housing to be built, but it comes down to the individual council person and what the council district and the constituents want. And a lot of these projects are still, Los Angeles is still a sprawling single-family suburb primarily. And the idea of multifamily, especially low-income housing, continues to be really contentious in all of those places. So it really depends on the council person to move that forward. I'm curious about here and how that differs.
Well, I think a lot of change is in the works, but obviously the new mayor is only in a month and a few weeks now. He did try to speed up some of the approval processes. So there's like 2 task forces that are there to basically cut red tape. And a little in the elections, we chose to put a little bit more power to City Hall to push things through, and a little bit reducing sort of the neighborhood's ability to hold projects back. But I think the ambition, we will see, there's an incredible ambition. And certainly, I think we can speculate of how that will be resolved. But my feeling is that it won't be the market alone and reducing red tape that is going to make it actually happen, or to really address, sort of this challenge of affordability.
I'm interested in this dialectic, the kind of dilemma, maybe even the conflict between market rate and affordable. Because often housing is broken into those two worlds. And at times when it's, at least what we've found, when it's very specifically very low income, for instance, the permanent supportive housing that we've done, the buildings are slightly different because they have a program like the supportive services that you might not get in, or you wouldn't get in market rate housing. You probably wouldn't even get in more straight affordable housing. So those are kind of special types. But one of the things that we've found is that in doing maybe more market rate or mixed housing, for instance, the One Santa Fe, which you wrote about very generously, which was an 80-20 project, 20% affordable, it was really just a designation.
Yeah.
The units were exactly the same, and the developer just spread the 20% across the project. But I think the question is does that kind of idea of affordability come primarily from let's say the entitlements designation? Or is there something more inherent to the way that you approach affordability? And again, in LA, I don't think there is so much, but I wonder if there is a difference here.
No, I think so. MIH, we have in this last project we have 27%. MIH, so mandatory inclusionary housing. The broker actually said the market will accept smaller units than the inclusionary housing because they come with a certain size of the width of the bedroom and etc. And so to build the affordable units, although MIH they pick within the building where they are, you can't meaning you don't have anything to say of where they are. They could be any of the units, so they pick sort of a mix of those units. But if you do the math, it's probably 1.5 times the cost of just building market rate housing. And so some of that has to do with the sizes, somewhat of that has to do with prevailing wages and the way it needs to be bought. And so I think that's really the big, we had some conversations also with Tank House, so I think we should really recognize for us these projects very much depend on one willing developer to do this with us.
Fortunately, one or very few.
Who are very keen at also figuring out how to crack this nut to an extent. But from their point of view, it really in order to deal with the scale of what somebody like our new mayor is talking about, it can't just all be sort of put into this vehicle that they have now of the capital stack and trying to sort of have the developers deal with
This
it.
is something that's been on my mind a lot in Los Angeles because if you look at the metrics, depending on whether you're looking at RAND report or state housing reports, the numbers of housing units that are needed can range from 250,000 to approaching 700,000 units that are needed now, not even in the next 5 or 10 years. That's an enormous number. And, I'm conscious that a lot of our projects are, 80 to 100 to maybe even 200 units. Even a project like One Santa Fe, which is approaching 500 units, is against those kinds of numbers, is a kind of drop in the bucket. And so there's this question about what types of mechanisms can be employed. And of course, a part of learning about housing, thinking about housing, you learn about the history of government being involved, doing very large housing projects, approaching very similar problems pre and post-war. The challenges with that, government has largely gotten, well, for the most part, completely out of it. So what kind of mechanisms
do you think it can be built
scale?
back? Because I was looking at, indeed, the Dutch sort of vehicles that exist, and indeed, 3/4 of the rental units are managed by these large organizations, and they don't just deal with affordability, but also the whole mid-range section as well. So basically, 75% of the people renting in the Netherlands are, within sort of there's four, basically the country is separated in 4 regions, and they literally manage the entire housing stock, and they have very long horizons, and they're responsible. They own the buildings, they maintain them, it's all taken care of in a certain way. But that, you have to build, it's something that it's started, at the beginning of the past century in the sort of social era, and has transformed to something where, there's people having real jobs there and making decent money, but not the sort of exorbitant money that the developer is making here. So it's a responsibility. It's part of, So I think the question is, would you be able to introduce something like that, which is quite large scale, and it really would take political action to bring that in.
You would think in a place like California, which for the most part arguably is a one-party system at this point, that you'd be able to get that kind of more cohesive movement towards that kind of an idea, but there's virtually no movement around it, and a lot of that, it continues to be a fight between the for-profit developers and the legislative systems. But it's made me think that one of the ways that maybe we need to kind of flip it on its head in a place like LA, where you really push for market rate developers who can build at scale. In many ways, they're the only building mechanism out there that knows how to build at a very large scale. to try to find ways to make it make sense to them. And that really generally means you have to somehow reduce the risk equation, the financial risk equation for them, so that they are willing to build either in certain places using certain techniques. We tried to do something with the county, which is there's the city, then there's the county that is a larger organization than obviously the state. But I was working with county supervisor a few years ago to write a piece of legislation, which it got read into the record. It never really got taken up. But the idea was that the thing the county has is all this excess property that they don't really know what to do with, has an incredible value. If you could take that property and basically turn it over to market rate developers for a very, very small sum, if anything, but with that to create stipulations for different unit mixes, different economies, and even we were talking about different ways of building, because we were really trying to push modular prefabricated housing in the city. That you start creating a more intertwined equation where it's not an us versus them, or one side of the equation versus outside of that. And I think those are things that are not necessarily architectural ideas, but they're instrumental to maybe unlocking some of these puzzles. And I think architects are, in a way, forced to begin to think like politicians, like lenders, economists, to make the work happen.
It's interesting, in Mondami's sort of committee for housing, no architect was involved, right? There was pastors, there was real estate developers, but no architect was involved in helping to think through how to do this, which is is worrisome. Have you had? I mean, have you had any sort of from a political side, because your housing is so well known in LA? Have they tapped you for insight? Because I think, we've been talking about it very much as it's a financial problem, but it's also a design problem to an extent. And so I wonder if with your projects you've had people approach it really on like what needs to change.
It's interesting because there's been within government very little outreach on the projects. Where there has been much more interest is in the development community, because they're looking for
it's the opposite with us, actually. It's
really?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. They're looking for inventive ways to do things, not so much to be great citizens. They're not thinking of it as a kind of social enterprise.
Because they're so economical, your building.
Exactly. Like, how did you do that? And can we replicate it? So we've had more conversations from that side of things, but in a lot of ways, I feel like there's rarely groups coming to us for that. We have to develop an idea, an approach, no matter how harebrained it is, and then try to go out and talk to council people, try to talk to the mayor's office, the county board of supervisors, to see if there's some uptick on this. For instance, we're trying to do a project right now in Altadena, post the fires in Eden Canyon. If people have not been there and seen it, none of the pictures can really give you a sense of how completely devastated an entire, basically small city is. There's nothing there. And we're trying to do a project that's really a mixed generational project, a kind of intergenerational senior housing, and then very young, mostly through mother and child housing, and young, like nursery school.
It is a non-profit. It's the same group, or
no. This is we're trying to create this amalgam between government, some nonprofit developers, and actually some for-profit development, because there has to be we think there has to be a commercial side to it. So it's really a mixed-use project with housing at its core. we are acting as the full protagonist, chasing down this. It's taken us a month and a half to finally get meetings with the supervisor to lay those plans out, to get her office involved. It's none of the things that I thought I would be doing when I started in architecture, but you realize how, in many ways, architects, I believe, and this is the distressing thing about no architects being on the board or on this committee. It's not just because I think architects should be on something like that. It's one of the few disciplines that sees across the full complexity of the problem and understands how to create connections, lines of thinking, to intertwine all of the necessary ingredients to try to move a project forward. And I think that is something often architecture, even architects don't utilize, a kind of talent for thinking through truly complex problems, developing a clear approach to it, finding ways to talk about it, represent it, and then eventually build it. That range of capabilities is in many ways at the center of exactly where this problem is.
What do we do? Let's talk about design.
Yeah, let's talk about design.
No, because I think, what I can say, we've had NYCHA, so the New York City Housing Authority, come and look at some of our projects to think about, new ways of circulation. We've had NYSERDA, which is the state, energy, who writes the energy code, because we have a lot of cross ventilation, for instance, in these units, because there's a lot of exterior courtyards, and so it allows, so for instance, within the current energy, like passive house standards, you can't have, natural ventilation in the equation, so they've been thinking about, can we measure this? So I think it's interesting. This is 450 Warren, this other first project with Tank House, which basically created a lot of interest, specifically with some of the borough president also came by to have a look. So there is a sort of everybody's like, hey, what is this building? Like, how does it work? And so what can we learn from it? So we hope it will affect some of those policies and in some way open up some of those things, but it will take, of course, a little bit of
I think
time.
this is where one of the powers of design actually is really centered. This idea of, one, that the entire project is a design problem. And you and I have talked about this a little bit, that often design is thought of as the thing that happens once you're commissioned by the client, and then you design the project, you make the project, and then the residents move in and you're done. Iwan comes and takes pictures, and everything is good.
As Louis Kahn said, finish it, photograph it, forget about it.
Right, exactly. Yeah. That's right. It was the 3 Fs or something, right? Yeah. So, but I think this is one of the places where we need to think about architecture in the expanded field, to borrow a term, that the design problem often starts maybe even before the client has the money, because we were just talking about this as well before, that we're involved in doing everything to set up the solicitation for the funding, to go to the banks, to go to the lenders, to do the renderings, to go out to the community. There's so much that goes on or needs to go on, and I think that is something that we have really taken on fully, is that the design problem is really not circumscribed in any kind of traditional
I mean, what is
way.
interesting, of course, so our clients here at Tank House, one is the son of Tom Main, so he certainly had a lot of architecture to deal with, and the other is Seba Mendes, who used to work at Foster's for a number of years, but we also see some of these other developers, architects turning developers. We have Alloy here in the city. There's some other people as well that tend to, but they shift. Sort of the expanded field means in some way they continue to think about architecture, but it's more defined as a developer, so to say, or the role is not necessarily considered the architect's scope anymore. In the meantime, if we go back to education, you see all these schools starting real estate programs, and a lot of students who actually want to have an effect on something choosing, to go there because they take on more risk, and they take on that expanded field that we're talking about. So I think it's happening. It's just not necessarily called architecture, but it might still be architects doing it to an extent.
I had somebody the other day in Los Angeles, a potential client, talking about exactly that. He said, really the biggest problem is that you still call yourselves architects. But if you look at all of the things you're doing, it would be much easier for me to go out and say, we have this kind of whatever, social something, like a different name. Yeah. Because the moment people hear architect, it really, it messes things up. And I think that's interesting, because I think it goes back to the kind of expectations that the profession, the discipline, really the profession, has set up, the boundaries around the profession that make it much harder to move across a lot of these lines. I also think that this is this idea of the kind of expanded field is important. The question, I think, for us, or one of the things that the Cooper Hewitt says in the advertisements for our talk was that we're doing urban housing. Yep. And there is something to that. So, what changes what makes it different to do urban housing as opposed to, housing as a whole? And for me, I think that question is really that housing is not an isolated, a kind of suburbanized idea, that it has to participate in the city in a much more consequential way. That can be programmatic, mixed-use project, of course. But I think it also says something about the way in which the project actually gets formulated. And increasingly, it's not hard enough, we've started to try to look at projects that are really not conceived. Housing is maybe the biggest part of it, but
not just housing. But
it's not really housing. Yeah. And they're not really even mixed use projects. They're trying to look at the possibility of invention in a different kind of urban form. It goes back to this idea, I think, of that architecture is, or housing is in some ways, a kind of microcosm of the city. Even just a house, you can argue, has all of the mechanisms of our life, socially, culturally, urbanistically. I think the buildings need more and more to participate in that way, and I think that also has the possibility of changing some of the economics.
Yeah. It's funny. I was just curious with your projects. How do sort of non-profits that don't use you, what do those buildings look like? Or I think for
horrible.
Yeah, for me, and it must be Iwan Baan, but the project is so clear, right, and so expressive. I see. You tend to not shy away from very expressive volumes, porosity. I think the idea of indeed the city sort of finding itself into the building as well. I'm curious if you hold certain, now you're at your fourth or something with them. What are the things, the go-to things? Or yeah.
I'll answer that. Then I want to ask you almost the same question. Right. It goes back in a funny, I think, in a way, to that first project I was talking about, Rainbow Apartments. Thank you. That after we finished that project and we had lost so much of what I thought the architecture was, I knew we needed to, the economics weren't going to change. The basic budget, the basic square feet, the basic construction approach. And for us in Los Angeles, almost all of the housing is built as 5/1 stick-built housing.
Exactly.
So it's
Yeah.
5 floors of wood over 1 floor of concrete. And that's a standard. You can't really go much above that. You can maybe build 2 floors of concrete, 5 floors of wood. And it's the least expensive way of building. It has a relationship to all the way that all of the
trades.
suburbs were built, all of that kind of housing. The economics of where the wood comes from, and just the expedience of it. And it's a really expedient construction technique. With that, one of the things that that we started to challenge ourselves with was nothing in the building we felt like could just do one thing. It was too inefficient. We started to have this idea about everything had to have a kind of triple idea. Everything had to we had to at least force ourselves to try to get 3 things out of every piece of the building. There was a technical component, maybe there was a kind of lifestyle or living component, and then there was maybe an aesthetic piece to it as well. And if you did that, then maybe you could really expand the aspirations for the architecture formally, spatially, especially within that same budget. And I think that's something we've been really successful with, because our projects are not any more expensive than what another one is doing. Yeah, no one would come back to you. But I think that ambition to try to force yourself to do that, I think that's particular. It's definitely an architectural idea, but I think it's also an ambition for certain architects. And for me, I'm curious. I have to say I'm kind of jealous, because I've seen your buildings in construction, concrete, above 5 floors at times.
Do the fires don't change that sort of 4/1?
It's not.
No?
It's not. I mean, the materials, the wrapper, the conversation is more about the kind of wrapper and how to make that more resistant. It
will remain wood
but
framing.
it's still going to be a wood frame.
Yeah.
Maybe metal frame, but it's still going to be wood frame.
Our formula. And I should say we have also Ted Baab in the audience, who was with us for 12 years, was very involved in some of this housing projects. So thank you, Ted, for being part of this journey. It's very funny. We started with Sam and Seba. We started on a different site first. So all the sites that we have are corner sites. And I mean, you probably know in New York we have the floor area ratio, which tells you how much floor area you can build, and you have the zoning envelope, which tells you how much volume you can build. And so normally what you try to do is build as little volume around the maximum floor area as possible. Corner sites, specifically also this one where 2 districts come together, they tend to give you a much larger volume, like a looser jacket in a certain way. We built most of that volume as exterior spaces that fall outside of the FAR, so exterior walkways, balconies, shared gardens, etc. And so where normally the development, path would be, let's maximize the FAR, let's make it as efficient as possible, everything out there, we just work the other way around. We look, what's the maximum volume we can build? That space is not expensive space to build. An exterior walkway is a slab of concrete. You don't have to finish it, you don't have to climatize it, you don't have to put any, stuff in it. And so the units are relatively efficient, but they have, 3, 4 exterior spaces that give you the sense of a much more spacious and a much more connected, and maybe to Jack's point about sort of this idea of being connected, the idea of loneliness, I think with these open walkways, with these more porous buildings, sort of this awareness of that your neighbors is much stronger. And I think it has turned out to be a relatively successful formula. That being said, we're talking about a very small group of housing. We're excited now with the larger 450 union, the rental unit where it's 170 apartments, to see if we can scale this up. Are you saying we need to go to question and answer? One last question for each other. Oh my God, okay. Tupac or Biggie? No.
We know what the answer is.
What's next? What's coming?
Yeah, I think it's really a question of what's next, and I think it is. I mean, from my vantage point on the West Coast, Los Angeles is in a very challenging moment. In many ways, there are a series of almost existential issues for the city. Homelessness continues to be a real issue. The fires were really significant. The affordability issue and access continues to separate and siloize the city and divide the city into maybe not so much physical lines, but very much social lines. And we're in the midst of mayoral election.
Yeah.
There's going to be a real fight about that. We have the Olympics coming, which is going to be could be we'll see, a nightmare. I think this is really the question. I mean, for me in LA, what's next is to a certain extent out of the architect's control. At the same time, I think this is a moment when architecture has to do more than be purely responsive to the kind of brief that comes your way, and that this is the time to use these different crises to try to invent some other models to at least redirect the conversation, or to point to a conversation which is about the future, as opposed to relitigating the slights of the past. So that's a different type of work. It's not a very profitable work, but I think it is again this kind of place where the idea of housing, which is really about living in the city and the life and the vitality of the city, has to be challenged again from there. I'm curious here.
Well, I think this is a great moment to start with Q&A, no or not? Yeah. Yeah.
Everybody has to say. Yep, thanks.
This question is probably more for Florian. There's a long tradition of public housing in New York City. You talked to the New York City Housing Authority apparently, and my question would be: is there anything we can learn from that history, or what not to do maybe, or what to do? And is there any kind of future for that kind of public housing in New York City?
So NYCHA stopped building right somewhere in the 70s, basically, and I think at that moment a lot of know-how, gradually has disappeared. I coming from the Netherlands, where I think housing is considered much more of a role of the government, at least the local governments. I would advocate, and I think with Mandami's sort of ambition, at least, that there's just more initiative at a government level, but it will take time because you have to build back all that expertise. I don't think you can just depend on the market to solve it with whatever tax regulation or discounts, etc. So I have a feeling it's something that needs to be built back, but it will take probably multiple majorial terms. So we will see how long this mayor will stick it out. Yeah, but yes, I think that something like that would be very, very necessary.
Michael, what's the equivalent of NYCHA in LA?
There are different housing agencies. There's one in the city, there's one in the county, there's a state housing agency, but they've in a similar way, they've gotten out of the development business. They offer mostly rental credits, and the developers take advantage at times of those. One of the real losses happened actually under a quite progressive governor, Jerry Brown, where the community redevelopment agencies were disbanded across the state. And in Los Angeles, the CRA had a real role. That was actually the kind of both development arm and also the intermediary between government writ large and development and developers in the city. And they did a great deal, not just housing, they did all sorts of development work. The building back of that, to Florian's point, I think is really complex. And I'm nervous about that because there's so much built up distrust in government that there's not really any patience anymore. There's not really any tolerance. There have been a number of big propositions. In California, we have these propositions where you can put something on the ballot and vote on it. And those propositions, like HHH, have produced, people have voted for a lot of money to go into housing, especially affordable permanent supportive housing. A lot of it has not been spent. The money that's been spent has been poured into just a few projects, and those projects have been very expensive, and that word is, that's all you hear about. And so the public is kind of angry and distrustful, and I'm not sure how that gets changed, except it really, in my mind, comes down to not so much a political system changing. I think you have to have a series of very strong leaders who have very strong personalities, which is why I'm interested in your mayor, to set the conversation in a different direction.
Hello, I'm really fascinated by both of your work. But I wanted to ask also about the Dutch model, because when you look at NYCHA and these gigantic housing projects all over the city, which are regarded and have been regarded for decades as an absolute social failure, an architectural failure, and it's all falling apart. And so there's this sense that we screwed up that model in America. We couldn't pull that off. And yet, to me, from what I know about Dutch housing, it seems like the model is very similar to the model that created the housing here. So how did you dodge all the mistakes that got made in America?
I think I don't think it's. I think specifically New York, housing is not the most terrible. What is interesting in New York is that the NYCHA projects are distributed throughout the city, where in many European cities like Paris or in Amsterdam as well, they were pushed to the perimeter. And I think what is interesting is that they exist in Manhattan, in Chelsea, they exist throughout sort of the neighborhoods. There are a lot of things that have gone wrong. One is the way these basically the way in which people perceive these, and then the way it's policed, for instance. So there is like a sort of, it's ghettoized to an extent, right? And it's stigmatized. I think some of these projects that are happening now, where they're trying to densify the NYCHA sites with corner solutions and integrating it and sort of further embedding it within the urban fabric, will actually sort of take away the stigma that these projects tend to have. I think they're not necessarily very poorly built. They're just really poorly maintained. Meaning, there's we once worked with one of the spokesperson of they've I think 1,500 elevators, and they have and they have one person who can repair them. So I think it's very much sort of the amount of I think it's a maintenance question and a perception question more than it is the original sort of intent of a lot of these neighborhoods. And you've seen neighborhoods, Stuyvesant Town, for instance, that has transformed, and most of the building stock is still there. It's just sort of upgraded and taken care of. So I think it's much less the typology, and it's much less what generated it, but it is sort of how it has been managed over time. And I think small upgrades will probably give you better construction than sort of tearing them down and building them anew, which is happening now in certain areas where developers are taking over these sites. They're keeping the NYCHA residents within the site, but they have to build a new building which will be much built with much less quality actually, and probably last much shorter than what those buildings from the 70s have done. So I think it's not a completely failed system. In the same time, I think it has changed a lot in the Netherlands as well. I think the scale has changed. There's now much more smaller scale sort of infill solutions. Architects are asked to be more flexible. It's less copy paste. At least now we have also computational design that allows us to be much more flexible and faster instead of trying to find ways to adapt it. So, but I think, first of all, I don't agree that it is a full failure, and at the same time, I think it can evolve into something that is more embedded within the city rather than sort of these individual large-scale projects.
And I just want to follow on that. I think everything Florian was talking about in terms of the history of those developments, the projects basically largely being isolated, the kind of social isolation being a huge driver for their challenges over time. Absolutely agree and see that even in Los Angeles, where a number of those projects were built. But I want to get back, I want to touch or reinforce that question of maintenance, because it, in a way, it's so prosaic as an idea, but it's absolutely integral to the entire thinking of these projects and the funding of these projects. For instance, in LA, one of the reasons we took on the modular housing was because the fit and finish, because it's built in a factory, it tends to have tighter tolerances, it tends to last longer, and it means that you don't have to do as much maintenance over time. And for these, especially the nonprofits, they're really challenged with the funding model around maintenance. They find ways to cobble together the money to build the building, but there's really no government subsidies or very little help in that. The money that they get are all in these rent subsidies for the individual residents in the buildings, and those are just baseline. And those tenant rents, of course, have to pay for the ongoing maintenance of the building, and they don't, there's a gap. And so over time, the buildings slowly degrade. It's just inevitable. It's not anybody's fault. There's no way that they couldn't start to just begin to fall apart. And that's been one of the reasons why the Skid Row Housing Trust has been failing, because they have these buildings, especially some of the older buildings, on their rolls, and they can't keep up with the maintenance. And so the system is not just about building the buildings, but the system has to be changed to keep units that are already existing online, as opposed to falling off the rolls, the housing rolls, because they literally are uninhabitable.
First of all, First of all, thank you for the conversation. I'm a student studying architecture in New York. From a student's point of view, I don't think that there's a lot of opportunity in school where you talk about regulation and legislation. My question is, after having worked with different committees and groups, how did that influence your teaching, and what do you suggest that students do to better prepare for the challenges of the real world?
Go for it.
I will say I think I learned more in practice than in school, but I also feel that it is not easy necessarily at this moment to get into practice. So I think one of that has to do with just the reality of today's, I think, market. The field is not in a great shape necessarily. I think in schools, it's first of all very important to understand sort of not just the way you generate space, but also what do you make it from, what are the materials, what are the costs, where does it come from? I think just understanding the financial realities. I mean, this is always a big discussion. In school, you're never allowed to talk about how much a building costs, right? Like, you can just design whatever you want, but you don't have to think about sort of how it's put together, who would put it together, and where would the money come from. I think that's one of the things where I think getting some understanding of like how do these things that you imagine on paper or on the screen would actually be realized. And maybe to Michael's point before of like, what is that expanded field? So how do you can, get beyond just the giving shape of a building, but also think through the other processes that are necessary to realize those things. I would also say, think a little bit more entrepreneurial. So don't just think I'm going to find a job and just do a certain thing. I think a lot of things are changing in the field, and I think thinking more from a sort of entrepreneurial point of view, rather than just thinking I will join some large corporation who will, employ me for the rest of my life. So I don't know. Like I think it's a difficult question.
Yeah, I think it is. I think we believe that you come out of school and you should have a kind of expertise. But in a lot of ways, when people, for instance, come out of school and come to our office, we're not looking for them to know how to do housing in that way. Like, I don't expect them to get in front of a monitor and understand all of those things. It's really complex. It's taking many decades to get an even better handle on it. For me, it is about trying to try to challenge yourself to be the strongest critical thinker that you can. And I know that's kind of abstract, but I think it has a lot to do with how you persistently ask questions and keep trying to drill deeper into the problem. That actually is really valuable for somebody when they're coming out of school. And I was talking to a group of students, Arizona State recently. This, I think, tacks on to Florian's point about being entrepreneurial. They were asking what they should do, what they should learn. Kind of not such a dissimilar question. My advice was to get out of the architecture school and go make friends, go have dinner with the people in the business school and the people in the government school, the people in whatever other schools are out there that are even loosely related to architecture. Because what you find when you get out into post-school is that you end up eventually really depending on your generation, your colleagues. You share a kind of idea about the world that is really poignant, very important. And when you're at a point where you can begin to take on these challenges of how does architecture exist in the city? What kind of role does it have? How do you continue to evolve housing to meet contemporary demands? That may not be coming from your fellow architect colleagues. That's probably coming from somebody who went to business school and is thinking about development in a different way. So that expanded field, I think, also has to do with the kind of cohort, almost generational cohort, that you begin to put together and stay in contact with as you move forward.
I think we have time for one last one. I'm going to go here, and then we'll have some time to mingle and ask questions directly too.
Yeah, he just asked my question. I was as an educator, I was going to ask that question in terms of how that works. Although I did, maybe to answer, I think that as an educator, it's our responsibility as well to impart on the students that the design of housing is not just the object, but the context and the different things that affects it, both cost in some cases when you can put it in there, but also the communities that they're designing for. And so the problem just isn't the building. I think the problem's bigger. My question has to do with me being a refugee from the West Coast. So, I'm still trying to figure out.
How do you feel about that the last couple of days?
I'm getting there. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly one thing that existed in the West Coast when I started practice there myself. Were firms that were kind of storied for engaging in housing, Lorcan or Herlihy, Pew or Brooks Scarpa, Koning Eisenberg. I mean, design firms, and some of these people were actually educators themselves. And so when you came into the community of architects in Los Angeles, you knew that housing was something that was a possibility. And it was even more compelling that the clients would be something like Skid Row Housing, and all the projects that you then learn, go to, take your students to. I would like, Florian, if you can sort of speak to the same sort of traditions of firms engaging in housing here. And Michael, if you could speak to what facilitated this historic opportunity where there is design firms that operate in this sphere and do a range of housing, from something for Skid Row to something that's built with developers.
Well, I can quickly just answer about that question about Los Angeles. I mean, there is, I think there has been a really extraordinary cohort of people doing work there around this issue, mostly in Los Angeles, some in San Francisco, some in San Diego. In LA, almost all of that group that you just named were all about the same age. We've all been in practice about the same amount of time. And we all began to come into this interest in housing around a very similar time as well. And it really owes that history to a couple of developers, Skid Row Housing Trust, really at the top of that. They were trying to figure out this issue around permanent supportive housing. They were trying to figure out issues around homelessness. They were trying to do it in the city. And there were a couple of people who were involved who were architects, and they believed in architecture. They believed that architecture could really have a role to change the equation, both in terms of the pragmatics, but also in terms of the visibility of the issue out in the community. So in that case, I think it was one of those fortuitous moments where there was mutual interests at the same time.
I think it's a little bit more difficult in New York, to be honest. I think some of it has to do, I guess, with the scale, with the cost of building in Manhattan. You could argue when, of my generation at least, somebody like Bjarke came to New York, he tried with his court scraper to come up with a new typology, but that's sort of the after that sort of he moved on and started to do other things, and it didn't have so much traction necessarily. But what I do think, and where most of the exciting things will be happening, is actually in the boroughs, and Brooklyn for sure is a place where, because there's maybe it's a smaller scale or there's less pressure. I don't know, but I feel there's some really interesting housing being developed there. There's a recent mass timber also project, Brent Buck. So I feel that there's more sort of typological sort of exploration happening in the boroughs rather than in Manhattan. But I don't think we have had this tradition that you're speaking about and Michael has been speaking about. I do think there's a lot of firms that would have loved to be involved in housing. I think some of the people like Alloy, which came out of Delaval Bernheimer, they were very involved in housing. They just started to make these buildings themselves, and similarly to I forgot the name of the other firm, but there's I'm blanking on for a second, but basically switching and sort of building the housing yourself is maybe the only way to go about it, because I don't think there's a lot of firms necessarily on that scale or that caliber that you're talking about on the West Coast. So I don't know if you escaped the right.
Come on back.
Yeah.
Okay, well, like I said, I know there was still some questions, but we do have time to hang out here for about 15 minutes or so if there was any questions you're dying to ask Florian and Michael, or Jack here too. Before we give a big round of applause, I just want to remind everybody that National Design Awards is like a year-round thing. We celebrate winners each year in 10 different categories, but the programs go all year round. The next winners are being announced in just a couple of weeks, which is really exciting. So at the end of the month, we'll announce the 2026 winners. If you'd like to stay in touch, the newsletter that we send out is the best way. It's called Design News on our website. So check that out, and please keep in touch. Come visit often. We have a great exhibition opening on Friday called Art of Noise, which explores the way that we experience music through both product and graphic design, and really fun programs that have music involved. So keep in touch, and thank you, Jack, Michael, Florian, thank you so much.
Thank you for having
Thank
us.
you.